Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Rashke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press. Our small press publishes books we want to see in the world, including Changing Paths by Yvonne Abreu, Conjuring the Commonplace by Lane Fuller and Corey Thomas Hutchison of New World Witchery podcast, and Verona Green, my latest book. Find out more about us and purchase these and other titles at thousandvoltpress.com. Ben Stimpson has always been keenly interested in stories, whether they were the folktales of his homeland or the personal narratives and lives of others. Ben hails originally from North Wales, but spent 29 years living in Ontario, Canada. Ben's professional and academic work is greatly inspired by his own personal journey. His writing focuses on topics related to spirituality and sexuality. Ben's personal spirituality has evolved a variety of traditions, including neo-paganism, Espiritismo, Hinduism, Lukumi Santeria, and British folk traditions. Ben is currently a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, or OBOD, and he was previously involved with the experimental spirituality group called Tribal Hearth. All of these traditions and groups have explored the power of story and narrative in both personal and community settings. Ben's deep interest in reconnecting with his homeland and exploration of spiritual traditions of that place led to a focus on ancestral work over the past half-decade, all of which culminated in his debut book, Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Building Ancestral Veneration Practices, available from Llewellyn Worldwide. Ben Stimpson, welcome to WitchLit.
Hello, welcome. Thank you. That sounds all very impressive, doesn't it?
It does sound very impressive. You've had a lot of life already, which is fantastic. And I can't wait to talk about all of that. But our first question for everybody on the show, as you know, is in this age of myriad ways to communicate that do not involve the written word, why still write books?
I did have an answer for you. I was thinking of this the other day. I think it isn't because of necessarily the information, because the information is available to us in all sorts of different ways immediately in our hand, right? I think that still writing books invites people to take a pause. I think it invites people to step into a world that they don't exist in. I think that it invites people to slow down and really take in and digest. So it's the medium. And I think up in Canada here, we have a very, very famous line connected to our publishing industry and our media industry up here. And it's the medium is the message. And so I think that when people are allowed to take a pause by diving into the written word, I think that it's allowing them to engage with the message, which is to slow down and to digest and not stay in this immediate gratification that a lot of media now is perpetuating, specifically having the internet on our phones. So I would say that. I hope that makes sense.
No, I think it totally makes sense. And I agree. Like, I feel like though they're, the bright and shiny of social media can be exciting and at times suck and all kinds of other things. But there is something still about sitting down with a book and really, engaging with that other person's mind in that way that you do when you read a book. I just think it's a completely different experience. And I mean, me personally, I don't care how you read a book. Like, audiobooks are reading to me. Like, that's storytelling is part of audio storytelling is part of human tradition. So like, when people get snobby about, well, you didn't really read it if you listen to it, I'm like, no, that doesn't, no.
No, I prefer, because of my because of my dyslexia and my dyspraxia, I actually learn better when I hear something read to me. And that actually ties into a very, very, very old and ancient form of relating information, which is storytelling, that oral culture. And I think that bridging the two, I think is a lot more powerful because it's a multisensory experience. You're listening to the voice of the person who is narrating. You're engaging with the material that somebody has written. when you're reading a book, although I love it, I do find that I prefer the audio version.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's a different relationship than if you're listening to a podcast episode or if you're listening to an interview where two other people are talking, because there's still that separation.
Mm-hmm.
When you're reading or you're listening to something that's been written, you're able to engage with that fourth wall dynamic in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really draws people in a way that other forms of media don't necessarily do. So I think that I think people get a lot more out of it because it ties into our psychology, in a different way.
Yeah.
But that could be a whole rabbit trail down.
That could be a whole rabbit trail. Yeah. It immediately made me think of two things. When, my son was little, he is of the age, I mean, he's almost 30 now, but he was of the age of the She Who Will Not Be Named magical children's books. And I read them out loud to him when he was a kid. Like that was, I was a single mom, that was our evening entertainment, is reading those books out loud. And now he and his partner live with us, my husband and I, and we listen to audiobooks sometimes in the evening together. Like they'll work on a puzzle and I'll, do embroidery, and my husband will sometimes double engage and look at Instagram while he's listening to the book. But, we kind of have this like family evening of listening to an audiobook together, which is just,
That's wonderful.
Like storytelling in front of the hearth kind of thing.
It's true. That's exactly it. That's the modern version of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And before the advent of television, that was the thing that most people did. What would they do? They would be sitting in the living room, in the parlor, in the communal space, listening to the radio. And in Britain, where I'm from, you don't tend to see it a lot more in North America, but in Britain, where I'm from, particularly radio shows that are drama, that are comedy, that are plays, a lot more popular. This is why we have Big Finish Productions, Doctor Who and Star Trek and all of these, right? Why they're such a popular medium.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's that relationship. You're relating to something in a different way, in a different way than television, where you're just staring at a screen, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I do love British audio plays. They're
Mm-hmm.
fantastic.
They're great. Yeah.
Yeah. Neverwhere, the Neil Gaiman Neverwhere
Mm-hmm.
one is probably one of my favorite ones. Like I've listened to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a comfort listen at this point. I've listened to it so many times.
Does he narrate that one? Because I know he narrates quite a lot of.
That one's actually full cast. There might be one that he narrates too. I think there is like a version of him just reading the text,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a full audio cast one that I think was a BBC4 production, maybe.
That makes sense. No, that makes sense.
Oh.
Yeah. I loved his Norse mythology that he narrated.
Yes.
Mainly because he used the voices that are inside his head. And I love that. The characters come to life.
Yeah.
And I think that in truth, that connects in with spirituality piece, is that, the written word is wonderful. It's great. But when you take something that's alive, like an oral culture, and write it down, it becomes dead. It becomes static.
Yeah.
When it's told, when it's spoken of, when even through an audio form, it becomes alive again. There's something about that quintessence that comes through the spoken word. And so I think that maybe that's partly why I love listening. Mm-hmm. It's also a danger because if you get a bad narrator, or if you get somebody who just the sound of their voice just grates, then you won't be able to get past that. A lot of the Suki Stackhouse books, I just couldn't get into the audio form because the narrator was just so.
Yeah, I've heard other people say that about those books, and I was also thinking that if there are any listeners who have a WitchLit bingo card or drinking game, they probably just took a drink because we mentioned Neil Gaiman. I feel like he's come up a lot on this show for many different reasons, but I'm with you on that. I couldn't listen to the Suki Stackhouse books either. There's something about. It was, and specifically the way she said Suki, that was one of the things that I could not get past. Like, no, sorry, can't do it. Yeah. No, and I've joked to people as I think once you really get into audiobooks, you find narrators that you like. And I have listened to audiobooks that I was like meh about because I like the narrator.
Yes. And that is very true. A lot of people do that. They follow. When I listened to The Mists of Avalon for the first time, and I can't remember I can't remember her name, but I went and listened to quite a few of her other works. And it wasn't that particular voice actress. She did both fiction and non-fiction, but she tended to focus a lot on history non-fiction books, which is totally my thing.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why I like Roy Dotrice, who did the Game of Thrones narration. And he did such an amazing job because he has such a strong British accent, and he was just right there. It was just like velvet. And they gave him a part in the actual TV show because of it. But he does a lot of the British history, especially medieval nonfiction audiobooks.
Interesting.
And so I tend to really he did a lot of the history of the Plantagenets and the Tudors and whatnot. Yeah. So it was kind of cool to hear that. And he's just, again, it's like with Stephen Fry, again, just has that quality. There's something about it, you know?
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the Ben Aronovich Rivers of London novels and Kobna Holman Smith, who narrates the bulk of them. They have a couple different narrators for some of the side books. But I could listen to him read the phone book. Just read to me. I don't care.
Love it.
So I do want to talk about your book now that we've talked about all these other books.
This is why we're here.
So I thankfully I got to read an advanced copy, even though I think like the real copies are making their way into the world as we record. But it's such an there's two things I really love about the book. I mean, there's a lot I love, but two things I really wanted to talk about. I love how you kind of broken into, this is the foundational thing of here's what ancestor veneration, worship, working with ancestors looks like in all these different cultures. Here's a foundation. And then here's how you might actually do it. Instead of just like, here's your 101 on working with ancestors. It's like, no, here's your like foundational prerequisite course. And then here's your intro.
Yes, that was very intentional. One of the reasons why I sat down to write it, I sat down to write it in during the pandemic, 2020, December of 2020. I'd already been teaching a course on this for my therapy clients. In 2019, I graduated from my psychotherapy training program. And I was looking at ways of bringing in spirituality, and ancestor work is so foundational to quite a few of the traditions I was a part of or was connected with. But what I think really distracted me when I looked at the material that was available, especially to people who are not part of traditions where ancestor work is such a strong foundation. I was looking around, I could see the need. A lot of my students were saying that they genuinely wanted to connect with their ancestors, but there were so many issues as to why that wasn't happening for them. I think there were so many issues around cultural appropriation. There were so many issues around relating to ancestors that, from a pagan standpoint at least, they didn't feel like they had any connection with because they were all Christians. There was a lot of pieces around, well, what do you do? And I think that Western culture also has a huge issue with that too. We've really been stripped or made strangers to the idea of the dead and the idea to the ancestors, partly because I think of a Christian point of view. And I say a Christian point of view because when you look at a lot of the Catholic countries around the world, South America, Italy, Poland, parts of Eastern Europe, right? Africa, particularly. A lot of the Catholic cultures have very strong ancestor work in those cultures, whether it be from kind of pre-Christian traditions or because of the Catholic mindset. Same with Orthodoxy too. So I really stress that. I don't think the issue is Christianity. I think that the issue is Western individualism. That's really, I think, where it comes down to. So it was very important for me to write a book that would force readers to really think about their worldview that they already have, and then translate that into, well, how then can that look as a lived spiritual practice? And really a lived ritual spiritual practice to me is all about creating that relationship and how to communicate. And that was quite a process to sit down and kind of look at those two parts. But I feel like I can sit with the book now and be like, okay, yes, this isn't a 101. Mm-hmm. This is not me telling you how to do ancestor work, but asking you, okay, you have this sort of relationship with your dead. You have this sort of relationship with your ancestors. How can that relationship manifest in ritual, mm-hmm. in a lived spiritual practice? That was very important for me. And the moment people start to think in those ways, at least from my own perspective, people take ownership of their spirituality in a way that is not going to create appropriation, mm-hmm. that is not going to be 101, and that is going to be really localized to them and their relationships with their ancestors, however way they see those ancestors. So I'm really pleased that you said that. That was very intentional on my part.
Well, it comes across, and I agree with you. I think
Thank you.
It's easy, I think, especially when you're approaching something newly, to look at it and go, oh, this is the way I have to do it. Or this is, mm-hmm. Looking at, like you said, around cultural appropriation, this is how this other culture does it. I don't know how my culture did it. I'm going to use these techniques. And I love how you talk about in the book, like you're going to confuse your ancestors because they don't know what that means either.
Totally. This is it. This is it. I was thinking about this before as I was getting ready for this episode. I think that the issue with people have, the misunderstanding people have with the idea of cultural appropriation is, and particularly for the pagan community, the people who would necessarily appropriate other cultures without seeing that as an issue, I think are the people who they're coming from a certain place of religious trauma where they're coming from traditions that were heavily telling them what to do. So now they find a tradition that gives them more freedom to express themselves. But within these traditions, a lot of the older traditions are gone. They're being reconstructed, they're being found, and new ways are being refound. There's a lot of leaders who are doing that. But then you suddenly have people coming in and saying, well, you can't take our stuff to fill those gaps in yours. Well, you can't tell me what to do, right? Mm-hmm. It becomes it's an individualism issue versus mm-hmm. a collectivism issue.
Yeah.
And I think as soon as a criticism is placed, suddenly it becomes a personal thing and people take things personally, and mm-hmm. that then becomes an issue. I tend to look at cultural appropriation in the way I understand it as, imagine going to a party that you haven't been invited to because it looks cool. Imagine if you're wandering through the park and you see a family having a barbecue and it smells good. The food looks amazing. You want some of that. So you go over and you insert yourself in, and you're not wanted there. You don't have relationship with anything going on there, but you're still taking the food because it tastes really good. Now, that to me is the crux of cultural appropriation. There's a difference there between being invited into that community and, being introduced and relating to those individuals mm-hmm. and being part of that community versus just inserting yourself in. But I think what needs to be honored there is that there's a genuine, especially with spiritual traditions, there's a genuine curiosity. There's a real subconscious understanding of that there's something going on there that I feel like I need in my life. Mm-hmm. I think that needs to be honored, mm-hmm. but how that goes about and how that looks is important. And also it comes down to communication. To me, I feel like all spiritual tradition, all magic, all ritual, when you really look at what it actually does, especially, whether it be with the universe or whether it be with spirits, all of it is a form of communication. It's a form of meaningful interaction. And so, I mean, even a daily kind of practice working with your own spirits, right? What you're doing is facilitating that communication with those spirits. They understand because they've developed that ritual with you. It's like learning a form of slang, right? When mm-hmm. you're with your friends, you talk with slang, right? Other people might not necessarily know that. And it feels awkward when somebody tries to use the slang of your group if they don't understand it really. So I think that is the issue of cultural appropriation, is taking up a language form that you don't really understand and trying to communicate with spirits you don't have relationship with. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so important to, either through cultural diffusion or an organic kind of assimilation process, that is culturally understandable. I would say that becomes then you're then integrating those things. And there's also a power dynamic there, a positive power dynamic there. So there's a lot of things. I talk a lot about that in the book. Mm-hmm. But I feel like I've talked a lot here, so please.
No, it's good. I think it's just a good conversation to continue to have about, what cultural appropriation looks like, what cultural appreciation looks like.
Yes.
How we can share things with each other in a way that is equitable and everyone understands what's going on and no one's being taken advantage of. That I think is important. I think a lot about how, we have a lot of division amongst us on this tiny marble in space. And how do we bridge those gaps? And sometimes it's just learning, it's not, I might learn about a practice I would never use just to understand culturally to attempt to understand other people culturally, even though it's not something I would do, but I might just read about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because then that understanding will be used in relationship. Mm-hmm. And the relationship is learning how to relate to others is something that is not something that we're born with, unfortunately. We need that information. We need that way of connecting. Mm-hmm. So then the big question then is, well, where are you getting that information from? Are you getting it from a second-hand or third-hand source? Or are you listening to the voices of those communities, whatever community it is, right? But that starts to get into much bigger, deeper questions. And
probably a whole podcast
there's
series.
A lot to it. Exactly. And there are podcast series on that. So
yes, exactly.
But
so the other thing that I really enjoyed in your book that I haven't seen in a lot of other books specifically about ancestral work or, kind of looking at working with ancestors is the idea of fictional ancestors, of characters from books and media. And I really, as a writer, of course, this is there are definitely characters that have had as big an impact on me as, a teacher. So, do you want to talk about that?
For sure. Well, it's interesting, again, how we tend to see ancestor and even how we conceptualize culturally and individually what an ancestor is, what a deity is, what a spirit is, right? That's all culturally created constructs. Mm-hmm. And but they help us then to relate, because our little tiny minds need to translate huge cosmic things, right? So when I sat down and I started to think about ancestor, I was reminded of conversations that will come up in Espiritismo and Lukumi when I was involved with those traditions. I am still involved with Espiritismo, but I've taken a break from Lukumi. But I remember having conversations with my godfather, who is of a Western background himself, but has been Crown Oshun for 20 years, I think it is now. When we're working with the ancestors, who do we call? Who do we include in our list of our prayer? And even within that community, there are many various opinions. Do you just go with blood relatives, in which case then it's just your pedigree, your direct line of descent? Do you include those who are broader? When you look at other traditions around the world, even the definition of family is different. I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and the interviewer, fabulous interviewer, really connected in. She has English heritage, North American heritage, Jamaican heritage, and she also has older, from 200 years ago, West African heritage. And her partner is from Nigeria. And we had a really fascinating conversation just around the basis of family. Because if you ask a Westerner in North America, white Westerner from, a WASPy background, who is in their family, they'll often just talk about their parents, their siblings, and their extended biological family. They may talk about their chosen family, but I think that's still a concept that's new for a lot of people. If you look at a lot of traditions around the world, even the concept expanded. How many aunties and uncles exist in a community, in wherever it might be? And those aunties and uncles are relationally based, not physically based. And so when I started to when I started to think about kind of even expanding the concept of family, who do we include, especially as a queer person? A lot of my ancestors are related to that queer identity. But then taking that a step further, well, I'm an academic. I'm currently finishing a BA, plans to go forward into my master's. A lot of the people who are in that chosen folklore profession, that medieval studies profession, are ancestral. I'm reading their words. I'm working with their legacy in my own legacy, right? So then it started to get bigger and bigger. And when I was shifting that focus, then I was like, okay, well, who are some of the people who are ancestral to me, especially fictional characters? When I came over from the UK, I suddenly had an accent. I didn't have an accent in the UK, right? So when I came over here, I had an accent. It was like 1995, and I had glasses. And when Harry Potter suddenly became big, especially with the first movie, what did I get called? Harry Potter, right? Yeah. So Harry Potter has been ancestral to me for a long time. I feel like I love that character still. I have a really strong connection with that character still because he's been with me throughout my life. And go figure, I fell on the sidewalk last year and got a scar on my forehead because of it. So great. I'm a witch. I practice magic. I have glasses. I'm British. I have a scar on my forehead, right? So it's interesting then at different times in my life how I've connected with him, but also other characters, right? I really connect with Morgaine Le Fay from The Mists of Avalon. I really connect with Raistlin Magear from the Dragonlance Chronicles, right? Because at times in my life, they've been really important. Those individuals have shifted and changed, but I feel like honoring that part of my story through these fictional ancestors is important because the relationship is still the same. So, because who are some of your ancestors of fiction? Now I'm curious.
You can tell you're a podcaster. Turning the question on me. Yeah, I was thinking about it when I was reading the book. And so like Jo March from Little Women has always been, because I wanted to be a writer from the time I was tiny, and kind of her journey as a writer to getting published, that was always a big thing. And then, and this sounds so academic and weird. And I have a little mourning in my heart because he just died. But The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Malone Kundera was one of my favorite books of my life. And I really identified with Sabine in the book. And so I really get that. I was like 19 when I read that book. And, it was formative in a lot of ways. Probably that Kundera did not intend for it to be formative for a 19-year-old. But I think that is a big one for me. And then, as a writer, there's there's writers who are formative to me in a way that I don't think necessarily show up in my writing, but are important. Like when I discovered Poe, in my English class in high school, and just drowning in Poe for 2 years as I tried to read everything I could get my hands on. And
so you're the Poe toaster. It makes total sense.
Truth comes out. For folks who don't know about the Poe toaster, you should go look it up. I will not spoil the surprise for you, but it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful story. And then, John Donne, of all people, John Donne's poetry, more his kind of romantic poetry than his religious poetry, but even his religious poetry is pretty sexy.
What I love about what you just did with that, so you just described really two sets of ancestors. You described fictional character ancestors that you connected with their story, and you connected, you spoke about affinity ancestors, those figures in the writing world who you aspire to and who inspired you at certain points along your journey. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to me. And I would, I think it's one of those things that I feel like if you're having trouble connecting to your ancestors because of trauma or adoption or displacement or whatever the reason is, like, it is a way, it's a window to that work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a window. And I have to be honest, I mean, I'm not taking credit for coming up with this idea. This is something that a lot of, when you really look, and other writers have spoken about this in different ways, a lot of psychotherapy writers. But when you look at then it not being classifying ancestors or spirits or deities in what they are, instead looking at how you're relating to them, then the relationship becomes more important, right?
Yeah.
Because what's the difference between an ancestor whose story you find out or who has been passed down in the family from 3 or 4 generations back, and you relate to them through what you've been told about them, to you picking up a book that you first read when you were 19 or 13 or even 5 and relating to the story of that individual in that fiction, right? The only difference is that one was alive 3 or 4 generations back. The other one is a creation of somebody's imagination.
Yeah.
But when we look at the way of spirituality, is like, it really becomes that liminal space. Characters are liminal in that way because are they necessarily only fictional and creations? We're starting to get more into the idea of egregores, and I talk about that in the book too.
Yeah.
But then folk heroes, we look at folklore figures. One of the big ones I talk about in my own book is King Arthur. I have grown up with the stories of King Arthur because they are so culturally huge, because King Arthur is a container for all of the other kind of aspirations of the community. The ancestors are the same. Biological ancestors become the same. Legendary ancestors, they, in the family, it depends. Then it comes down to size of community. But within the family and in the extended family, certain ancestors become huge and they become containers for the family story. So you're relating to story. And I think that's really the key then, to look at how expansive ancestors can become, because affinity ancestors are the same, conceptual ancestors are the same, and so on and so on. And I go like 2 chapters of exploring these different forms of ancestry in the book. And that was a really fun part for me to write.
And I think it's interesting to compare it to like stories of your ancestors. One of like in my own ancestral work, I've been doing a lot of genealogy research, and as a person of mostly English, German, and Swedish descent, so my German and Swedish ancestors are recent immigrants to the United States. I'm 3rd generation on one side and 4th on the other of my dad's side of the family, and the German and Swedish ancestors. But my mom's family is English largely, with some Irish and Scots thrown in there. And I'm direct descendant from people who were involved in the Salem witch trials. I'm a direct descendant of people who came over on the Mayflower. These were horrible people. I'm not descended from the good side of Salem. Let's just put it that way. Like, my ancestor was one of the people who accused Susanna Martin of being a witch. And my other ancestor was the constable who took her to Salem Village to be hanged. Like, these are not good people. And I only know this from doing this research, right? And I'm like, so what does this mean to now carry these stories, to know this about my ancestors? And I was talking to other people in my family about it. I was like, well, we're not responsible for that. I was like, no, we're not responsible for it. Like, we did not do those things. But I think it's important to acknowledge those stories and what they mean, and how do we move forward? How do you integrate that and move forward? She asked the psychotherapist.
No, this is a very good question. This is one that gets asked a lot. This is like one of the key questions. What do you do with ancestors whose stories you don't connect with and who you judge, or who are no longer reflective of the how you see yourself and how you want to go forward. You said something very key there. These are not good people. So that right there is a key phrase, because you're still relating to them now as they were 400 to 300 years ago, right? So there's a couple of pieces there. And again, everybody has to come to their own conclusions with this. But I have found what's been healing for me is to know that just as we as individuals can change, so too can the ancestors.
Right.
I think Western individualism and Christianity has placed the ancestors in a place where they are suddenly static and locked in. Now, if we think of ourselves in that way, in 200 years' time, they may be looking, our descendants may be looking at us as horrible people because we didn't get what is current for them. Right. Now, does that make us bad people? No, that makes us human. That makes us human. Back then, in the Salem witch trials specifically, let's say, they were products of a particular cultural constellation that they found themselves in. There were a lot of culturally based understandings and misunderstandings. Now, things that shock, like Jack the Ripper, for example, that's what's shocking to the culture, right? I think that is a good example of that type of ancestor. Whoever is a descendant from Jack the Ripper now, if he has descendants, can look back and say, no, that was horrific. But in the Salem witch trials, that wasn't seen as horrific when that was happening, because that was part of the culture. Now, that isn't to condone what happened, but I think we have to be very cautious there about how we then project our own culture now back onto those. And then the key point there is then how are we then relating through our culture now to those individuals back then now, right? We can tell the stories and understand the context. As a historian, it's very important for me to understand context, because I know that that's history. I know that that's not now. The key step then is in understanding the context of that time and understanding that our ancestors played roles in that, is then understanding, okay, what is the string and what is the thread to now? What stuff from back then is still present now and has been perpetuated, which is that idea that misogyny, of that idea of punishing difference, of that idea of all of those things, right? A very, very good example of this is with slavery and slaveholders, right? I was interviewed by somebody a couple of weeks ago who they found themselves in a position when they were doing their own genealogy that their ancestor was also came over on the Mayflower, right? And understanding that Puritan kind of concept within their family, the idea was, they were Puritans, they were good Christians, they could never have had slaves, until they figured out that, yes, they did actually have slaves.
They did have slaves,
They actually did have slaves. And so then as a modern queer person themselves, how do they deal with that, having that part of their family? And we talked about that. And they came to it on their own as well. I think a lot of people hopefully do. But it's that idea of you're not responsible for what they did, but you are responsible for what they handed to you. And if what they handed to you was privilege, what they handed to you was the aspect of the culture that is still systemically disenfranchising, marginalizing, and killing people, then it is your responsibility to take note of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of ancestral healing. Some of the ancestors that I've worked with myself, who they did not do good things in life, in their relationship with certain people in their life, they're holding on to that weight now. We can have the opportunity to unburden them of that by changing what the context that they handed us, right? And in that way, that's a release. That isn't condoning what they did. That isn't saying that what they did was okay by our standards and sometimes even by their standards. But what that is not then perpetuating that pain going forward, right? I hope that makes sense.
Oh no, totally makes sense. And I think a lot about like that in terms of like just what we're learning like about epigenetics and things like that, like how this is something we carry in our bodies as much as we carry in our souls, I guess.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. And again, it all comes back to story too, right? If you were in a context where, burning witches was seen as a moral duty by any good Christian, then you wouldn't have necessarily grown up in an environment where you would have seen the Salem witch trials as wrong, right? And so that also is a huge piece too. How much of us are built within the societies and the social context now, right? But I think the duty of us and the responsibility of us is to understand that context and to make a better world for our descendants. Now, that being said, then we have to let go. It's then the opportunity and the responsibility of the descendants to make the future for themselves. So this is where we get more into kind of spirit work. If you have ancestors who you're connecting with, who you have a strong vibe that they are not liking how we're living now, and they want us to go back to the good old days, those like lower level ancestors who are in that mire and that muck, who are still connected to the world, then that then becomes okay, well, you're not going to be on the ancestral altar. I'm going to leave the collective to put their combined weight onto you so that you then don't mess up our world and don't mess up us, because it happens, right?
Yeah. No, I think that ancestral work is important. And I also think the other thing that you point out in the book is that you learned, and your ancestors all told you, not to live in the past.
It's huge. Yeah. Yeah, that was huge.
That we have to be in the now.
Yeah. And it's funny because yesterday for my own podcast, I had Ash McKiernan on, whose book is Word Crafting, and being a psychotherapist himself too.
Yeah.
It was a very fun conversation. And we got into that idea of in the liminal spaces is where magic happens, right? And I feel like oftentimes the ancestors become part of the fabric, and then we are diving in and around in those liminal spaces. But we're at the idea of the confluence of destiny and the confluence of history and the confluence of all of these things has become a big part of my life. And when I knew that something big was happening in my life, when things happen in my life and they're big and they're not from this world, they're from the other world, I get a physical feeling. And I had one year where I had 7 men from my life come back into my life. Some of these were people who I was holding on to. I had put them on a pedestal and I was still connecting with them, and I needed that connection cut. Other people I needed closure with, or they needed closure with me. And like 2016, the start of it, I was living in a place where I was just really living in the past. I was so focused on the past because I didn't think I had a future. I was in a really negative mental space. And all of these people came back into my life. And again, like I had that physical feeling. It was like that ripple that something was on its way. And I couldn't ignore it. And by the end of the year, it was that sense that I need to live in the future and the present and not in the past anymore, because nothing's going to change for me. And when I sat down with my godfather in Lagumi, we were chatting about that. He said, well, the ancestors tend to do that. They want you to be healed. And the reason that they want you to be healed, and the reason that they want us to be in a good position, and can often be a selfish thing, but they want the living to be in a good position to make more living, because they want their legacies to continue. They want, that's the agenda of the ancestors. They want the human race to continue. So they want us in our healthiest places, right?
Which, I imagine there are a lot of ancestors who are really concerned right now about where we are as humans. I laugh only because I will cry otherwise. But, so speaking of living in the now, I guess. So what does writing look like for you now? I know you're in the process of finishing your degree and moving back to the UK, which, international move is always adventure. I've done it a couple times. It's an adventure. So like, what does now look like for you writing wise?
Right now, I'm in a very, very strange place. I moved in with my parents to save money. I'm working mostly I'm working entirely online, I should say. All of my clients are online. I'm in a weird liminal place of, I feel like I'm at a bus stop. Mm-hmm. And that feeling of I'm waiting for my bus to come, checking my watch, and it's very distracting. So right now I'm forcing myself to focus. I've already moved on to my next project. Llewellyn hasn't greenlit it yet, but I want to continue on with it, so I'm in a good position when and if they do. Mm-hmm. But I'm on to my next project. The ancestral work is now foundational and background for me, and we were talking briefly about this before. But it's a weird feeling for this to be coming out because I've already been excited about it for so long, and now I moved on to my next project. It's like, okay, I can be excited for other people's excitement necessarily when I've written a book, because, I know I've written a book, it's one of those. Yeah. So it's a very strange thing, but this year is one of those, completing the final pieces in Canada before I move. Mm-hmm. And so I'm feeling like I'm starting to withdraw energetically. I'm already in the UK. Mm-hmm. And so I'm now kind of going through the motions. But I was very, very fortunate. Again, the hand of fate, the hand of the ancestors, the hand of the spirits are in my life. When I moved in with my parents, I thought, oh God, I'm going to be, here in the woods with my parents forever for next year. And I was able to find a beautiful working space up in the closest town. And it's only like 5-minute drive north. But it's one of those shared office spaces where you can pay a subscription fee and just go in and sit down and do your work. And so that's been a real powerful place for me to go. I've gotten into a good routine. And really routine is the bedrock of my work right now. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting in having one foot in the UK already and one foot here and being in that liminal space again. It's interesting then, how am I relating to this landscape that I'm moving away from? Because this landscape has been home for 28 years, but I've never really had a strong connection to it. And now I'm starting to get a connection to it. So it's kind of a weird thing, but it's that kind of that, when you're a friend of yours is moving away and you try to spend as much time with them before they go. It's that kind of feeling. So it's a very strange feeling. And I feel the same with my writing. Like I'm really pressuring myself to get my writing done and focus. But like my first book, it took 8 months to write that because I had a lot of breaks in between. I needed to digest. So I know what I want to write. I just need to digest it. So I feel like I'm in also like that digestion mode right now. Yeah. So,
yeah. I think, I always feel like writers are kind of like on a separate timeline from readers. Like, we're in this place of where the writing happens, and that's pretty lonely. Like you're pretty much by yourself, unless you have a critique,
totally,
or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then when the book is out, then there's this whole new interaction that happens. But like you said, you've already moved on to the next thing. And it's kind of like trying to be in two places at once sometimes, mentally at least.
Weird feeling. Yeah.
Which I think is a little bit like moving away from a place too. Like I've joked, I grew up in the South. I was born in Detroit. My dad's family was all from Chicago, Michigan area. But I grew up in the South, kind of like you being born in Wales and then growing up in Canada, similar kind of thing, except in the same country. Although I often wonder if US states are different countries in their own way. But, and now I live in California and I feel more a Southerner than any time I lived in the South. And that's been true when I lived in Canada. That's been true when I lived overseas in Slovenia. That being a Southerner becomes part of my identity in a way that it never is when I lived at home.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
So, yeah.
It is fascinating. Can I ask, where did you live in Canada? What part of Canada did you live in?
I lived on Vancouver Island briefly.
Oh, well, okay.
My ex-husband was Canadian, and Vancouver Island is probably one of the most beautiful places in the world to me.
It's gorgeous.
Like
isn't it?
It's just, it feels very liminal to you in like so many ways. And we were in Nanaimo, which is, largely First Nations people. And it's so foggy. Like you always just kind of feel like you're not attached to the rest of the world. Very Mists of Babylon kind of thing going on there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's interesting, like this idea of place, like, and trying to reconcile that with like also, the cosmos. Like, what does it mean to be from one patch of dirt here compared to the rest of the universe?
Well, and this is the thing. How much of us are really composed? I try to fight off Buddhism when I start thinking about this way. Mm-hmm. But how much of us are really composed of wherever we are, right? Mm-hmm. Wherever the context that we're born into, the land that we exist within. How many of our spirits in our landscape are also composed because of that? But I think that in many ways creates that grounding. If you believe in the idea of reincarnation, then it's important that when we come into this world, we have that solid context that we can exist within, because then that creates that's really the multiplicity of lives. It would be boring if we had the same life going every single time we reincarnated, right? Yeah. If you believe in reincarnation.
Yeah. I'd like to think we get to mix it up a little bit.
I hope so, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't have any, I really admire people and have a little envious, I guess, really, of people who have like a good sense that, yes, I was somewhere before. I've only had like glimmers of it. And I'm fascinated. There's one of those constant sources of fascination. So.
I have a strange relationship with myself. People in my circle, in my social circle, it's a very important thing for them. Mm-hmm. But I guess for me, it's that immediacy. It's that not living in the past, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if I was Marie Antoinette, right? It doesn't matter.
Been Marie Antoinette, right?
Everybody's been Marie Antoinette or Alexander the Great, or It doesn't matter to me what that context was, because although, yes, in some religious systems that creates the context that we're born into now, through karma and whatnot. Mm-hmm. The goal of life is to live. That's really where I've come to in my life. Because if you're focused so much on the past, you're not living. If you're focused so much on the future, you're not living, right? And I think that needs to often be said, especially and the danger of ancestor work. People can become very, very caught up in the stories of their ancestors. Yeah. But they're not actually living. Right? Yeah. They're not creating a story for themselves to pass on. Yeah. I think that's important. And plus that idea of lands, right? Like there's so many different cultures, there's so many different lands, there's so many different places to explore. I think that a lot of people hope for a sense of home. And what does home look like? And what is that relationship to home? Ontario hasn't been home to me for a very long time. But that is a story I was telling myself. Yeah. Now I'm on the verge of leaving to go to a whole new country. Really, I've been back and forth to the UK, but it really is going to be a whole new country for me. Mm-hmm. What is that sense of home? What is the story I'm telling myself of what the UK will be like when I'm home, right? And again, that's a relationship that comes back to story. And that's really, I think, the power of story in our lives and how we're relating to. Which comes back to our work with ancestors, our work with deities, our work with spirits, our work with place, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm.
Wow, I think that's really a good place to move on to our next part of the interview. Though I could honestly listen to you talk about that forever. But I try to keep it to an hour because that's my attention span personally. When I'm listening to a podcast, I'm like, if it's more than an hour, I always kind of go, oh, do I really have time to do this? But before we get to our game of chance question, I wanted to give you an opportunity to plug what's coming up. This will air early December.
Okay.
So you can kind of let people know what's coming up in December for you. I mean, obviously you're moving, so you got a lot going on. But yeah, just where can people find you? Where can they find your work? And then we'll play our game of chance.
So so everything's on benstimpson.com. That has all of my social media. That has all of and please do go and follow my social media if you'd like. That really gives a good boost. I host a podcast. My fall series is going to be entirely devoted to traditional and folkloric witches. And so I have a great lineup of guests coming on there. Most of them are already recorded, which is good. And so each week there'll be a weekly distribution. I do have a load of classes that I will have up by this time. And so those will be both live, and probably I'll try to offer pre-recorded classes too. But I really like teaching, so I really do appreciate that teaching piece more. Not just on ancestor work. I have a load of history classes that I'd like to do. I have a load of classes that I have a 13-week British mythology and folklore course that I've developed, and that will be offered again. I also offer psychotherapy and counseling and spiritual services as well. So, and particularly from like a pagan and queer bent. So if I work a lot with narrative therapy story, right? So a lot of my clients tend to like to work with the stories of deities and mythology, and how that then impacts and relates to their life. So I am taking clients currently. And apart from that, I'm not sure. It's a few months away from kind of what I have planned. So
yeah. It's like living in the future instead of living in the past in a weird way.
Right?
Yeah. Well, cool. So all that links will be in the show notes for folks.
Wonderful.
So they can find that easily. And I will plug again. Yeah. Following on social media doesn't seem like that big a deal, but it actually does boost things.
It's huge.
And what people may not know is when you're pitching a book, they want to know how many followers you have.
It's true.
So it is a tiny help you can do for authors you want to see more of their stuff. And it's free. You don't even have to go look at it. Just follow them.
Oh, it's huge. And people don't realize that. Like, it's very disheartening to see views of episodes on your podcast being more than the people who are following you. Right. And I mean, but it depends on kind of where people are at too. Like, I know Instagram and TikTok particularly. I'm not a TikToker. I don't really connect with that. But I know Instagram is a lot easier to follow. Facebook, again, tends to be very, different, but it's a weird thing. But yes, please do go follow my socials if you've enjoyed this. And let's do the game of chance.
All right. So you've listened to the podcast, so you know how this works. So I always joke, and it seems like a even more interesting joke to make with a psychotherapist, that I don't know how to do small talk because I'm a Scorpio. I think it's honestly more because I'm a writer than a Scorpio. It's like I want to get down to the juicy stuff quick. So I'm going to roll a die, and depending on what I roll, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you want. And there really are no rules to this game. So if you're like, I don't want to talk about that, we'll roll it again and see what else we get. 6, you get to pick.
Ooh.
It's been a while since we've had a 6. Lucky you. Or not. I mean, maybe it's easier if you don't have to pick.
Oh, let's see here. What are the options again? Let me ask you that.
Death, sex, religion, politics, or money.
I don't want to talk about death because that's the whole book. Let's talk about sex. I think sex is a fun one. Let's see.
Okay. So I was like, I usually try to make the questions about the book, and you really talk about sex in your book. So I was thinking, I agree with many other people who said this before me, that magic is inherently queer, right? So I kind of like ponder on this chicken and egg thing. Are there a large percentage of people in the occult who are queer because magic is queer? Or are we drawn to it because it's queer? Do we make it queer because we're queer? Like, how do you see? It's like I worked in the restaurant industry, and I'm always like, do you become an alcoholic because you work in a restaurant industry, or are you attracted to restaurant work because you're an alcoholic? Like, these are,
I mean, it's a good question, right? What comes first, right?
Yeah.
I think the vast majority of my magical friends are all queer. I have very few straight cishet friends who are part of the community. That I really connect with going forward. I know there's a lot of people probably listening to this who are like, but I'm cis and you're friends with me. I'm saying like the people who are closest to me, right?
Right. And I feel like the vast majority of people I know in the occult, whether I'm close to them or not, are identifying somewhere either on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, or are they neurodivergent, or both?
Or neurodivergent, exactly right. And then when you bring the trans into that, like I know tons of trans, queer, neurodivergent people who are also witches and all this, right? I think that it's hard because there's multiple pieces to that. I think that the initial interest is because traditional culture doesn't accept queer people. So there is a searching for a space that will be accepting and also bring empowerment to. And I think I was talking to a couple of my guests about this. Most of my last season's guests were all queer. Many of the people on my current one are also queer. And all of them seem to be in their 30s, and, right? So if we were to go back 20 years, what we had was a load of gay boys, a lot of queer people, and what was on the television? Buffy the Vampire Slayer. We had, Charmed. We had all of these really witchy type programs, and all of them showed strong, independent people who were fighting against authority. We had The Craft, same thing, right? So suddenly we had these images of witchcraft and paganism that was empowering. And I would say that now we have many examples now, right? Like American Horror Story Coven is a good example of that. Sabrina, the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. There's all of these examples. This comes back to the idea of story. So for me, and I think a lot of people of my generation, or like of our generation, I should say, we had these figures.
I think I'm ahead of you. I'm an Xer.
I'm 37, and you're
50.
probably what? So you're still within that range, right?
I mean, I'm in that range.
Slayer, right?
But I was like a full adult when The Craft came out. Like I had a kid already. So,
but Practical Magic, The Craft, those earlier, right? Did they impact your approach to like? Did they create your or help to create your interest?
I think so. Yeah, and weirdly. I mean, I think there's other media that I think about too, like Water for Chocolate.
Okay.
The book and the movie, both. Those were big influence. Even though I am not, of Chicano or Mexican descent in any way, like that book was incredibly powerful. And I also worked in the culinary industry. So it's like,
so you really connected with those pieces, right?
Yeah. And like Chocolat, like the Joanne Harris book, same
Chocolat.
kind of thing. And the movie.
I love that.
Yeah. So those were big influences on me personally too.
Yeah. So big influences on you personally. And I think that's been a lot of interest in the queer community in witchcraft and spirituality comes from that. It suddenly impacts us personally, that this is a space that we can exist within, find empowerment within, express ourselves through, explore ourselves through. It also so happens that witchcraft happens to be queer. But I think that initially it's that we're fleeing from a place of pain, of suffering, of marginalization, and we discover this space that promises all these things. And I think in some ways, I think the narrative, it's difficult because I want to say that partly the narrative of witchcraft is queer is a narrative that has been constructed because so many queer people are in it. But I also think that it's inherently queer, like, and I think it comes back to that place of marginalization. The reason that I think the witchcraft trials really impact and we connect with them in such a strong way, particularly queer people, is because we know what it's like. We know what it's like to be looked down upon in a community, to be hurt, to be killed because of something, and it's other people's prejudices.
Yeah.
In a similar way, I think a lot of African American and BIPOC people really connect with ATRs in that way because it promises a space that they can go into and explore themselves through and express themselves through And those traditions just so happen to also be survivals of things that colonial powers tried to stamp out. So I would say that's how I would approach it. I think the chicken and the egg. I think that it's an initial place of pain looking for empowerment. And then it becomes an understanding of, oh, this is really queer. I don't think that it is a shock, but the vast majority of folkloric and traditional craft witches who are writers, and I know because I've interviewed most of the recent ones, are all queer, and they all speak about the queering of the craft. I don't think that that's a surprise. I think that there could be criticism as to why there seems to be so many queer writers being chosen by publishers. But I also think that that goes back a very long way, and that queer people have been in the craft and in spaces of spiritual authority for a very, very long time, and that's cross-cultural. Yeah. You look at various cultures around the world, right? The Mahu of Hawaii, the Hijras of South Asia, the Mushe of South America, right? All of those have aspects of spiritual authority, spiritual role. And I think because spirituality in general is liminal, that our identities being liminal because of ostracization of the community creates those spaces for us. So if any of that made sense, I feel like I just went all over the place.
No, I think it makes sense. And I also think there is something to how the word queer itself has been applied. Like, I think that the definition of queerness is expansive in and of itself.
Yes.
To engage. So. I mean, I've talked about people, I've heard people talk about themselves as neuroqueer instead of neurodivergent, which I also really think that is part of it. It's like this queerness as a word before it was applied specifically to gay or homosexual people was oddness, right? It was the weird WYRD. Right. It was this uncanny kind of thing. So I think it makes sense to me to have this expansive idea of it. And I feel like, I look at, people in their teens and 20s now and people in their 30s and 40s now, and we are getting queerer.
Very much so. Very much so. Yes, very much so.
That's the future I want, It's like this idea that you can embrace whatever you need to embrace, that we don't have to embrace, this static idea about family, ancestors, who we are, who we love, all of those things, that it's all expansive.
I agree. But I think that there are, I am not a postmodernist. I'll be honest with you. I'm not a postmodernist. I think that there are certain aspects of our psychology which will reassert itself again and again and again, just in different ways. Yeah. So I think this speaks to the real importance of chosen family when it comes to the queer community. I think that speaks to the reason why so many people find the idea of tribe or clan as an expansive model of relationship and small community so important. And that goes right back to our psychology. There's certain numbers in our psychology that once we exceed those numbers, it becomes too much, right? Most of us will never have more than 300 friends. When you really think of close personal friendships, most of us will never go beyond that, because we start to make acquaintances, we start to make strangers, we have that level of intimacy, right? And that's just because of how our brains are handling processing information, right? So I think that there are certain universal truths that are biologically based with the human species. But then there's a huge number of those things that are also constructs as well. Yeah. So I think that, the idea of community, wanting small, intimate community where we're relating to each other all the time, however way that is defined, is important, right? Yeah. And so you start to see polyamory is just another form of that. It's a form of community that happens to include sex or relationship or sex and relationship, right? But they're still creating family structures out of that, just not defined the same way as traditional. And I'm using bunny ears when I say traditional.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it's that idea that I think you're right. I think we're hardwired for the village, right? And now we're having to create it ourselves because we've been taken out of it because of our economic and political structures. So now we're recreating it, basically.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And I mean, that can also get into a conversation then around kind of how much are we defining our identity based on our perceived roles in those communities, right? I know a lot of people who, when they find, I don't like using this term, but it's something that people will know. When people find their tribe, what can often happen on a psychological level is suddenly not knowing who they are, because suddenly you're surrounded by people who are very much like you, have very similar stories. So then who are you? I find this with myself. I get caught in this myself. For such a long time, 28 years, my identity has been as a British foreigner. I'm a British person in Canada. That's my culture. That's who I am. When I go over to the UK, who am I? Right?
A British person who lived in Canada for 20-something years.
Well, it might shift that way. But then, I remember the first time I really connected with the pagan community and started with the big group when I was working with Tribal Hearth. I remember going there because up until that point, my spirituality had been all online. It had been like I didn't have physical community. Suddenly I show up and suddenly there's like 150 people who were all engaging and interested in all the things that I was interested in. And suddenly I was like, shit, who am I? I don't even know who I am. So what did I do? I got into needing to prove to them that I was part of that group. And that caused some issues, right? All things, right? But it does suggest then that idea of that invitation to then take ownership of our lives, step into who we are, and really explore self in a different way than we would normally. So, but again, bigger conversation.
But I think that's a good place to kind of wrap things up. But
perfect.
A good note to end on about, to let people think on that. But thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation, and I know it's going to be over an hour. Sorry, y'all. It's going to be over an hour, but it's all good. It's all good. It's all good, right? But thank you, seriously, and I'm looking forward to what comes next for you.
Thank you. I am too. And I'm looking forward to your own stuff too. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have in store for us. So.
Thanks for the little plug there. I appreciate it.
Of course.
WitchLit is a production of 1000 Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. Sue Fertal edits our transcripts, which are available with all of our previous episodes at witchlitpod.com. You can follow us on Instagram and Threads at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.